Before removing the spokes, document the spoke pattern. The triangle of the hub points to the valve stem hole. The first inner spoke is 3 nipples clockwise from the valve stem, and the second is 4 nipples from it, and so on. The first outer spoke is 4 nipples counterclockwise from the valve stem, and the others are 4 spoke nipples away from each other. So I'm removing the spokes from the wheel because I'm going to have the hub vapor blasted, and then I'm going to try to clean up the rims. I'm going to inspect the spokes to see if they're salvageable, and the nipples. Now I got a spoke wrench from Boxer 2 valve, and spoke nipples come in various sizes from 5.6 to 6.8 millimeters, so they're fractional sizes. And on this bike, these are the nipples. The 5.6 seems to be just about right. And these are the spokes, which in the day and age that they were made were chrome plated, and I'm going to clean them up just to see if they're salvageable. And if not, I'm going to go ahead and replace them with stainless steel spokes and nipples. I use Croil, and I put a little on the threads on the spoke, and then I also put a little on the nipple. See if I can find one here to show you. I put a little here on the well around the nipple so it could get into the thread at the top, and I let that sit for about an hour. Now when I run into a really stuck nipple, I'd use my little propane torch to heat it up and try to loosen up the nipple on the spoke. So I get it warmed up, and then I put a little Croil on it, which will get pulled in, and then it gets loose enough on the threads that I can take it off with the spoke wrench and not round off the nipple. Well, I have the hub removed from the rim, and this is the pile of spokes and nipples from the front wheel. When I removed the spokes, some of them were visibly bent, so I pulled them out. And after I cleaned them, I thought I'd use a glass plate and just see if any of the others showed too much of a bend. So what I do is just lay it on the plate, give it a little push, and kind of watch as it goes. Now that one's okay. This one, when I laid it on the plate and give it a little push, it just doesn't want to roll because it's got a bend in it. And if I get it to roll, you can see and hear that one's kind of bent, so I'm not going to use that one. So these are the rear wheel spokes and nipples that are still good after I inspected them. Now there's 40 spokes and nipples on the rear wheel. I ended up with about 17 usable spokes and maybe about 7 or 8 usable spoke nipples. So I've changed my mind. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to replace the spokes and nipples, and going to go for stainless steel spokes. Now this is the rear wheel on the R80ST, and according to Bob Fleischer, aka Snowbum, there's an offset from the edge of the rim to the edge of the brake housing here, or I should say the brake side of the hub, and it's 3 millimeters. So this rim is 3 millimeters away from this edge, and that's done so the rear tire won't rub. So I laid the rear wheel down on my workbench on the brake drum side, and there is a gap. Now I have about, I think, an M3 nut, and it measures right at, it measures right at about 3 millimeters, just a little shy. And then I have an M4 nut, and its thickness is closer, it's between 3.5 and 4. Now if I slide the little M3 nut, it goes under the rim, but the M4 won't. So that confirms that the offset on this rear wheel is very close to the 3 millimeters that Bob mentioned. In preparation for lacing the wheel, I inspect every one of the spoke holes in the rim to see if there's any cracks. I looked at all of them and I didn't see any. I also inspected the holes here in the hub that the spokes go through. There's some burrs, but no cracks on this side. And on the inside of the hub, I didn't find any cracks either, so that's all good news. Now I want to check that the rim is flat and not badly bent. And I'm using a 0.5 millimeter feeler, and I went all the way around and it would not go under. And I also checked on the inside and it would not go under. So I've got a nice flat rim. Now the wheel takes 40 spokes, and these are stainless steel. Now the other thing I want to do, because it's a lot easier than using a spoke wrench, is be able to use a screwdriver in the nipple to tighten it up. But because the spoke can extend outward, I also ground a little groove into the blade of my screwdriver, so there's some clearance if the spoke pokes through. And I used a Dremel tool with a milling attachment to make that little slot. Now on the front rim, you can see the arrow which shows the direction that the wheel is going to rotate. And that arrow is on the right side of the rim. So when I put the rim down on the workbench with the hub, I make sure that the arrow side of the rim is down on the workbench and the left side of the hub is facing me. Now from the picture, this is the valve stem hole, and this is the little triangle on the hub that the two spokes go in, and one of those is right directly across from the valve stem hole. So I've laid down the front wheel hub, and this is that little triangle here which points at the valve stem hole. Now the holes here and here and here all the way around I marked with an eye. Those are inside spoke nipple holes on the rim, and on the other side are spokes that are going to go to outside nipples on the rim. So I'll be able to use that to get started, and then I'll just repeat the pattern. Now there's a detail in the design of the spoke head, and near that black dot is a little ridge in the head of the spoke, and that's used to stabilize it in the hub, and I'll show how that's done later. So I'm ready to start lacing. I have my little triangular piece here on the hub right across from where the valve stem hole is. This is the inside hole, so I'm going to run a spoke in, and it's going to go to the 1, 2, 3rd hole. So I put my spoke nipple in, and I'm just going to tighten it gently, about a roll like that, just to get it in. And then my next inside is going to go this way, and that one's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 holes. So the nipple goes in and just turn it just to catch it. So I'll just continue doing that all the way around until I get all the inner spokes installed. So here's the wheel with the inner spokes on one side installed, and I checked every one again all the way around, and there's 4 nipple holes between each one, and they're all in the eye hole all the way around. So now it's time to work on the outside spokes. Now the first outside spoke is going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 nipple holes from the valve stem hole. So I'll slide that in the hub, and then put the spoke nipple in, and like I did before, just give it about a half turn to catch. Now the next one will come in this way, like this, and it should be 4 holes from here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a spoke nipple goes in like that, and I had a little bit of a turn. And so I'll just continue doing that until I get all the outer spokes installed. Okay, I've got the left side outside spokes installed. So you see they cross over once, goes all the way around, so I now can flip the hub and rim over and work on the same approach to install all the spokes on the right side of the wheel. So the layout on the right side is the same pattern, and I put my little marker here inside outside. So the spoke goes in here, and it's going to be 1, 2, 3 holes over, and do the next inside hole, and that should be from here 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I have all the right side inside spokes installed. So now I'm going to start with the outside on the right side, and this one comes in, and just like on the left, starting at the valve stem hole, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we just sort of keep on going now. So I've got all 40 spokes and nipples installed into the front wheel. Of course, everything's loose, and now what I have to do is tighten everything up and get the wheel true. And I'll show how I do that next. So now that I have the spokes installed, I'm ready to start truing the rim. And one thing I did was mark the inside of the hub, each of the sections with a number. There's 10 sections, and that's helping me with measurements when I take them, so I know where they came from. And the other thing that I've done to the rim, which I showed earlier, is there's a little red tape by the valve stem hole, and I always start adjusting from that area. So I want to talk about some of the details of the layout of the spokes. You'll notice that there are 4 spokes in a group, and then another 4 spokes in a group. Now the 2 outside spokes go to the outside of the rim, and the 2 inner spokes go toward the center of the rim. So that means that if you want to get the radial distance adjusted, which is centering the rim on the hub in this direction, if you tighten or loosen the 2 inner spokes, that's going to have more effect on the radial movement. And if you were trying to get lateral truing, which is in this case up and down, because I've got the wheel lying down on the workbench, then the 2 outer spokes are going to have more influence on that. Now that said, all 4 spokes do affect both radial and lateral, but again, the major influences, as I mentioned, are the 2 inners give you radial adjustment much quicker, and the 2 outers give you lateral much quicker. Now another detail about the front wheel is that the hub actually has a extended nose on both sides for the axle, and the width of the hub is almost the same as the width of the rim. The rim's just a little bit thinner. Now, if I just lay this down on the workbench, the rim's going to sag, and I'm going to have to do a lot more work to get it trued. So what I've done is gotten some scrap pieces of 3/4 plywood and put it on the bench so that the rim and the hub are lying on it. And I use 2 pieces, and that gets the rim just about the same height as the edge of the hub. So it's going to make truing it laterally a lot simpler. Now, before I put the wheel in the truing stand, I'm going to try to get the radial adjustment made here on the workbench. So I'm going to start getting the rim centered on the hub, and I'm going to use an 8-inch vernier caliper and make measurements between the inside of the hub and the outside of the rim in each of the 10 sections until I get it pretty close. Then I record my measurements on this little diagram. These are the little triangular blocks that the spokes go into in the hub, and these are the numbered sections. So I'll record my measurements all the way around. Now, before I start tightening any spokes, I just want to, everything's loose now, I just kind of want to get the hub and the rim close to center, and then I can start tightening spokes. So I'm going to use my vernier caliper and zero it. Section 1 is directly across from 6, and 9 is directly across from 4. So just going to kind of see where I am. Now what I do is try to get it level up and down, and then I wiggle it just a little bit until it's tight. I find the tight spot. And it's about 179.9 for section 1. And for section 6, it's about 179.3. So they're pretty close. And I'll do the same with these two. And if I find there's more than about 2 or 3 tenths of a millimeter, I'll push the hub a little until I get them pretty close, and then I'll go around and start finger tightening spokes. So I've got it pretty close, and now I'm just going to finger tighten the center spokes and go all the way around the rim and do that. Now that I've got the 2 inner spokes, the ones that are toward the center of the rim, finger tight, I'm going to go around and measure all 10 segments and see what I've got. So these are the measurements I took, and the biggest distance is about 180.6 to 180.5, and the shortest is about 179.9. So they're opposite each other. This side's a little too long, this side's a little too short. So what I'm going to do is loosen the spokes, the center spokes on this side, and tighten the center spokes on this side just by finger. And it should help move this over a little bit and shorten it up on this side and lengthen it up on that side. So after loosening these and tightening these by my fingers, I made some adjustments, as you can see by the numbers. Now over here, I summarized the highest and lowest and the difference. So I started with about 0.7 millimeters of radial play, which is way too big. The maximum is 0.5. And then here, after I did the little adjustment with just changes in finger tightening, I got down to about 0.4. And I may make one more set of adjustments. So these are the numbers after going around one more time. And I did need to use my screwdriver to tighten up a little bit. And what we've got now is down to about 0.3 millimeters on the radial direction for variability. So that's pretty good before I put it into the truing stand. One thing that's interesting is this section 3 is always fairly big related to the ones on either side. And it's possible, in fact, that there's a bit of a deformation in the rim right there. Sometimes people have hit curbs or bounced against something and deformed the rim. So that one may be a little bit of an indicator of maybe some minor bending that went on. Because if you don't have that, then it's down around 0.2-ish, which is a really good alignment. Now before I put it in the truing stand, I'm going to finger tighten the outside spokes all the way around, and I'll probably just check to be sure I didn't distort anything on the radial dimension when I did that. But that should be enough to hold the rim in the lateral dimension. So I put the truing stand on top of my workbench, and there's a spindle. Now this spindle has two threaded cones that go on it, and they tighten down on these threads to hold the wheels securely. And before I insert them, I make sure that the wedding band and the shims are centered, so when I run the spindle in, I don't catch on them. And then I just screw in the other cone in the back until they're tight on the hub. Now the cones on the spindle have a set screw which I tighten, and I put the spindle in the top of the stand, and it's also got a set screw which I tighten, because you don't want the wheel moving in any dimension while you're trying to get everything trued. Now the stem of the dial gauge had a small feeler in it with a little ball bearing, but it's too small a contact area, so I took them out so I get a flat area here to engage the rim with. Now this dial indicator I've set on the edge of the rim, so it's going to measure radial deflection, and then this one I've set on the edge of the rim, so it's going to measure lateral deflection. So then I zero both of the dial indicators right at the valve stem hole. So I originally started measuring the radial distance changes on the outside of the rim, but it was pretty banged up. So what I finally did is I put the little ball bearing tip back in on that particular micrometer, and there's a reasonably flat section on the rim on the inside. Now there's some pits in there, but I found this was more reliable on this wheel for getting the radial measurement. So what I'm going to do is start adjusting the outside spoke and attempt to get that to the lateral changes no more than 0.2 millimeters. To help me keep straight what I'm doing, I made a little piece of tape here, and it shows that when I get a negative reading on the dial indicator, it means the wheel has moved too far to the left, and so what I need to do is adjust it to the right. And similarly, if I get a plus movement on the dial indicator, that means the wheel's moved more to the right, so I need to adjust it to the left. Having that to look at makes it a lot simpler to keep doing things correctly. So I'm just going to spin the wheel and take a look at what's going on. This is the lateral, and this is the radial, and I'm going to zero them and just spin. And here it's going down to minus 0.5. Now it's going to plus, and it's up to like 1 millimeter, 1.5. And then it starts to go back down again. So I'm going to work on the lateral adjustment next. The little V mark just tells me I'm at the valve stem, and as I rotated, I put a negative here and a little mark. What I'm looking for is to get the lateral movement no more than plus or minus 0.1 millimeters, because the total deviation can be no greater than 0.2. And this indicates that I'm beginning to get past minus 10 millimeters. And I keep rolling, and then right here, it switched over to about plus 10 millimeters. And now I keep going, Now that's a pretty long section of plus 10, and it ends right about here. Now, if it's plus, that means that the rim is pushed over to the right, and if it's minus, it means it's pushed over to the left. So what I'm going to start with is adjusting the big long run of plus and try to get rid of it. Now, in each group of 4 spokes, the outside spokes cause the biggest change in lateral movement. And this one, which is over on the left side, if I tighten it, it's going to pull the rim that way. So I'll start tightening these in each group of 4, and as necessary loosen these and try to pull this whole section of rim over to the left. And I'll do that in small increments, because even as I work in one section of 4 spokes and make a change, it will cause some deviation in the adjacent section as well. So you don't want to try to make the correction all in one change. You want to do it incrementally in small amounts of rotation of the spoke nipple, and then see what the difference overall is. And that way you can get closer to what you want to achieve and not overshoot. So I'm going to use my spoke wrench to tighten and loosen. And one of the things that you should keep in mind is that when you turn to the right, you get tight, and when you turn to the left, you get loose. So if you take your right hand and you curve your index finger, that means in this rotation is tight. And if you use your left hand and curve this way, that's loose. So right, tight, left, loose. Remind yourself of that, because sometimes you get yourself confused. So I'm going to start out by just tightening the spokes about a half turn, and I need to tighten the inside. So right is tight, so I just go around like that and take every one of them about the same amount, so I'm not getting too tight all of a sudden. And I just keep going around, and then I'll take a look at my dial indicator and see how much difference I've made. So the dial indicator is back to where it was too big before, and you can see I'm actually minus a 100th of a millimeter. So I made some adjustment, and I'm just going to spin it and see where I am. Still a little big in some places, but interestingly it goes negative much sooner than it did before. So actually I've overcorrected a little bit already, which I'll go back and fix. Now as I work my way along the rim, you can see here I'm going up to minus 14 and then back down again. So I need to adjust this section a little bit. So I'm going to start by loosening the spoke on the left a little bit. And you can see that the deviations come down. Now I'll back up again here. So I'm going to loosen this one just a little bit. And I'm going to tighten the right side, which is actually quite loose. So you can see it went from minus to plus, just because that spoke was loose. Now we're still a little bit big here, so I'm going to back off that one a bit and tighten the right one a bit. And that's too much. So I'll back that off a little, down around 0.06. And we go back to a little bit too much negative in here. So I'm going to tighten one of the inner spokes just a little bit. And that gets rid of it, and loosen one of the inner spokes just a little bit. So I did most of it with the outer. And again, you see here, it's a little bit too much. So I can loosen this guy a little. And he comes down to about 11. And I'm going to tighten the inner one a little bit, because I need to reduce how much it is on plus. And that smoothed things out pretty nice. So just to review again, if it was too negative, loosen this tighten this. These are the outsides, because that gets you the biggest adjustment. And then if you need a little addition, use the insides. This one's the left inside, this one's the right. So if I loosen this left inside, the wheel's going to come over to the right. And if I tighten the right outside, the wheel is going to come over to the right. So I make most of the adjustment with the outsides, and if I need a little additional, I'll try to tighten and loosen on the insides appropriately to get things smoothed out. And as I do that, as you noticed, it'll ripple a little bit to the adjacent section of 4. So you want to roll your wheel back across the section you worked on, the one before it, and the one after it. And if there was a little bit of variation, too much change, play with these guys to smooth it out a little bit. And just kind of work through each of those sections of 4. So what I find I'm doing is I tend to be working on smoothing things out across 3 sections of 4 spokes. And that seems to work pretty well for getting the fine adjustments done. So starting at the valve stem but rolling the other way, you'll notice that the negative is still okay. It doesn't get any bigger than 0.1 millimeter. And then right in here, I get a little further, it comes back down, and then right in here, it just takes off. It goes up to minus 0.21 and then right back down again. Now I marked that section, and it's very short little piece, about like that. And when I look up here, it's right in the area of section 3, which is that section that I noticed when I was trying to set the radial deviation and get it true. There was an anomaly right in that area. It jumped up radially, and I'm seeing it jump up laterally. So I suspect that this is where there's been a bit of a bend to the rim from having hit something. So one of the things that I do is I usually just ignore this section, because there really isn't anything I can do to get rid of the larger deviation inside it, and just work on smoothing out everything on either side of that. So I've adjusted the lateral movement, and things are looking pretty good. It bumps up to 10 and 11 in some places, but generally it's within tolerance. So this is the radial indicator, and you can see the differences, minuses, and some pluses. It transitions from pluses to minus. So I went back and noted where the minus transitions to plus on the radial measurements and marked it on the rim. And then here it goes from plus back to minus, and then it transitions again back to plus. So after looking at the rim, this is a negative, and across from it is a negative, and this is a positive, and across from it is a positive. So what's happened is this section and this section have been pulled in, and I think that's caused these two sections to bulge out. So the way to proceed is to loosen these, and then tighten these and tighten these to get rid of that bulge. So after those adjustments, here's where I am now. And the radial is bouncing between minus 0.25 and plus 0.25, which is pretty good. And the lateral has gone out more than I'd like in certain sections. So I'm going to have to come in and make some finer adjustments to get the lateral back where it needs to be. But I'm making progress. Patience is a virtue. When I started working on the spokes, I originally used a spoke wrench I got from Boxer 2 valve. And as I did some more reading, I learned that there's also such a thing as a spoke torque wrench. And the difficulty with using this is you really have to have the sense of feel for how tight the spokes should be. And I'm a novice, I don't know what that should feel like. So I went ahead and picked up a spoke torque wrench kit from Warp 9 Racing. And it comes with a set of sockets for different size spokes. And this is the 5.6 millimeter socket that fits the nipples on the R80ST. Now it comes with a handle that you can use to just tighten spokes, and it comes with a torque wrench that you can set in inch pounds or in Newton meters, and the graduations on it are much easier to read in Newton meters. The box also includes a conversion table that you can use to go between inch pounds to Newton meters. Now, I contacted Buchanan Spoke and Wheel, and they recommended that the spoke torque should be between 40 and 45 inch pounds. Now, there's a little detail about the torque wrench. You'll see there's a little ball here and a little hole here on the socket. They need to go together like that, because if they are like that, then you can hear the wrench clicking as you turn to the side. But if you make a mistake and you put this on other than in that dimension, over here somewhere, you're not going to get any torque because their clicker won't engage. So it's very, very critical when you put the socket on that you line up the little hole in the socket with the little bearing, ball bearing in the head, so that you're going to be getting the torque wrench action when you tighten up the nipples. Now that I've gotten the spokes tightened up a bit and the wheel protrude more, I need to set each of the spoke heads in the hub using a punch and a hammer. There's a little ridge on the side of each spoke head, and if you tap hard on the head, it'll seat it into the hole in the rim, and that will keep the spokes from loosening up. So that's what I'm going to do now. So here's where I am at this point. Things are looking pretty good. Once the rim is trued, the next thing I want to do is inspect the spoke nipples and look at where the spoke is. It should be recessed, but if it's proud of the head of the spoke nipple, that needs to be ground off or it's going to puncture the inner tube. So you'd use, in my mind, a good Dremel tool with a burr on the end. You can grind it out and get it back to where it's flushed or a little recessed. But when I spun the wheel and I looked at it, none of my spokes were proud. So that's one less thing I've got to do. Now, as is the case in the front hub, the rear hub uses 40 spokes and nipples. However, the rear spokes are a little shorter, and all 40 of them are the same length. So I have the left side of the rear wheel laced up, and on the rim, here's the arrow, and since it's on the left, it should be pointing counterclockwise because it's in the direction that the wheel rotates when going forward. And the right side's all laced up. So I've laid the wheel down on my workbench, so the brake drum side is on the workbench and the left side's pointing up. And then the rim is going to have a 3mm offset from the hub. So what I'm using are M3 nuts, which turn out to be 3mm thick, and laid them under the rim. And then when I use my 8-inch vernier caliper to center the hub, like I did with the front wheel, I'll end up with that offset before I put it in the truing stand. Since I'm going to rotate the hub as I tighten up the spokes, I used some tape and taped 3 of the M3 nuts right on the edge of the rim, so they'll always be in the right place as I move the rim around on the workbench. So I put a spare battery on top of the hub just to make sure it stays flat on the workbench. And as I tighten some of the spokes, there's a tendency, of course, to pull the hub up. So putting that on top should keep it flat while I get the radial adjustments done. So here's the radial measurements I made on the rear wheel. The first set gave me only a 0.2mm difference, and the maximum could be 0.5, so that's a pretty good number. And then I went around and tightened all the spokes so they were about equally snug, and measured again, and all the check marks show I had the same measurements, and in a couple of places it moved by a small amount, but the total difference still didn't grow, still 0.2mm. So everything's good. The other thing I did was visually look under the rim and made sure that the hub is flat on the workbench now that all the spokes are finger tight or a little bit tighter. I haven't moved the hub up, so that's good. I'm ready to go ahead and mount this in the truing stand and finish up. This is the Mark Parnes wheel balancing kit that I have. There's 2 deep cones and a shallow cone, and 2 end connectors, and 2 bearings and end caps. Now the R80ST rear wheel does not have wheel bearings, so I can't use the truing stand spindle to mount it. When I mentioned that to Matt Isles of Isles Motorsports, who I borrowed the truing stand from, he suggested trying the Mark Parnes wheel balancing axle and attachments, and it worked. Now it comes with a bearing, and it comes with a short cone, and also with a locking sleeve. So I mounted the short cone on the face of the hub, which is inside where the brake shoes go, put the locking sleeve on and tighten the lock screw, and then put the plastic cap on the end, and that keeps the bearing from sliding on the shaft. Now on the left side, the long tapered cone fits, and again the locking shaft and the plastic cap. And after I tightened everything up, I checked, and the wheel is not moving laterally, or is it moving radially? So it's pretty solid, and that looks like a good way to work with a rear wheel that doesn't have any wheel bearings with this truing stand. So to stabilize the bearing on the top of the post, I used a strap and strapped it down on both bearings, and that kept it a little more rigid. However, after I'd make any adjustments to the spoke, it was pretty common for the wheel to shift a little. So what I'd always do is roll the wheel back here to the valve stem and re-zero the 2 dial gauges, and then roll it back out to wherever I made the adjustment, and see how much difference I made. It's a little time consuming, but it works okay. Now, as you recall, I set the rear rim offset to about 3mm, but as I tighten up the spokes, I want to verify that it's not shifting. So I take a little piece of all thread and lay it across the hub like that, and hold it, and then I use my caliper and I measure the distance from the farthest out section of the hub to the edge of the all thread, and I already measured the thickness of the old thread, and I know it's about 7 millimeters. So I need to be around 10 to 11 millimeters, and that's about where I am. So that means the rim is staying recessed. You want to check that as you go along, because I didn't do that once, and I managed to pull the rim flush with the hub. So I had to loosen up all the spokes and start tightening it up again. Now if you find that the rim is too far this way and you need to pull it back, you want to loosen the spokes here that are on the right side and tighten the ones back here which are on the left side, which will tend to pull the rim in this direction. So you can correct the mistake without taking the wheel apart. And what I normally do is just go around and loosen these right side spokes just a little bit, and then tighten up the left side spokes about the same amount, and then remeasure. And I keep doing that until I get the offset on the rim in the range I need it to be. After I finished truing the wheel, I put it back down on my workbench with the brake drum side on the top of the bench, and took my M3 nut, and it looks like it's uniform and within the 3 millimeter offset, so it's good. So here are the wheels after refinishing them, lacing and truing the new spokes. They're looking pretty nice.